Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to our latest in the current series of Planning Live webinars. My name is George Sismey-Durrant. I'm an associate in the Brody's Planning and Environmental team. In our recent Planning Live session, which was termed "The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of NPF4," 1 year on, one of the topics which we touched on briefly was flooding and the interpretation and application of Policy 22. So such is a concern among developers around how Policy 22 is hampering development. We thought that it would be useful to take a closer look at flooding and particularly Policy 22. And so today we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Michael Stewart of Kaya Consulting. So Michael is a hydrologist and hydraulic modeler with over 25 years of consulting experience. He graduated and worked at Babti Group in Glasgow, including 2 years working on flood forecasting in Hyderabad in India. After that, he had the hydrological sciences team for consultancy in Vancouver in Canada, and then returned to Scotland and joined Kaya Consulting. Kaya undertake over 100 flood risk assessments every year in Scotland, and Michael has hands-on experience of how Policy 22 is being implemented and applied at the moment. So, as I say, I'm dealing with your questions, but asking the questions of Michael today is Elaine Farquharson-Black, whom most of you will already know as one of our planning partners and head of our house building team. So I will pass over to you, Elaine, and thanks very much.
Thanks, George. And hi, Michael. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Before we dive into NPF Policy 22, I thought it might be useful if we went a little bit backwards first and kind of set the scene and look at a little bit at the evolution of the Scottish Government's policy on flooding. So looking at flood risks, the types of development, etc., that might be encountered. So my recollection, this is showing my age, when I started planning, the flood risk was you had to account for the 1 in 100 year event. And I think that lasted until Scottish Planning Policy 7 on flooding was introduced in 2003, 2004. And we moved to the 1 in 200 year event, and that was carried forward into SPP in 2014. Can you, again, to set the scene, just remind us what that means? What is a 1 in 100 year event? What's a 1 in 200 year event? And, explain a little bit about the differences.
Okay. So by 1 in 100 year, it effectively, it's sort of a nice way of saying it's got a 1% chance of occurring in any year. So although the idea it would happen once in every 100 years, it doesn't mean that if it happens, it doesn't happen again for that period of time. So it's just a risk. It's a way of explaining the risk and the likelihood of the flood event occurring. So a 200 year has obviously got a 0.5% chance that it might happen in any year. Obviously, that percentage chance counts. If it happens in 1 year, it's still 1% the next year that it might happen. And I guess there's no magic behind the 1 in 100. I think it was used almost as an indication of a human lifetime, that perhaps you might get one flood of this amount. It might happen in your life or it might not. So I don't think there's any magic by the choice of 100. That's sort of just a planning or a human choice as to what that is. That's still the flood event in England, and in Scotland we've gone for the 200-year event. I'm not sure. Maybe someone online will know why. Maybe we just wanted to. Maybe we wanted to be different. But anyway, it's the 200-year in Scotland.
So that meant, in effect, in terms of development, instead of forecasting for will I be affected for the 1 in 100 year event, it's the 1 in 200.
Yes.
So it's more precautionary.
It's more precautionary. So effectively, what we do as hydrologists is there's standard methods where we work out what that flow might be for any watercourse or for any rainstorm. You can work out different probabilities that you get a certain flow or you get a certain rainfall. And that's fundamentally based on statistical analysis of observed data. So already it's based on, obviously, with climate change, that baseline changes over time. So not only do we have a climate effect in the future, there's obviously regular updates to the flows and to the rainfall data that we use as we go through time. So if you did a flood study 20 or 10 years ago on a river and you did it again now, you would get a different flow or a different rainfall amount. So, and that's what we basically predict what flood extent would occur from that, and that then becomes your basis of planning decisions.
Yeah. And in terms of the flood risk and where those flood risks emanate from, just kind of talk us through the different types of flood risk that you might have to be assessing.
So NPF4 is an SPP as well, but NPF4 is quite clear that it's all sources of flooding. So we generally tend to focus on river watercourse flooding. It tends to be sort of some of the most dramatic. But also you get surface water or pluvial flooding, which is flooding that's caused basically what you often see in urban areas where you get intense rainfall, you get flooding on the roads. It's water that hasn't yet gone onto a burn or a river, and it causes flooding issues with runoff from higher ground. We also get obviously coastal flooding significant. That's a mixture of extreme tides, storm surges, and waves. We also have to consider groundwater flooding, although that's not such an issue in Scotland. If we get flooding from groundwater, it's generally generated from just high river levels or runoff. Whereas in England, if you have chalk catchments, you can get flooding from groundwater in areas where there's been you have rainfall many kilometers distant and it causes groundwater flooding elsewhere. And then obviously sewer flooding. But often with NPF4, that is, you have to look at that, but that is obviously also related quite closely to the pluvial flooding as well. And obviously, if you get a very large event where it rains, then all of these things can get mixed up together, and you're not quite sure where the flooding quite has come from.
Now, I'm sorry because I dipped in and out of there. I think my connection dropped, and that's me kind of come back again. You did mention climate change a little bit when you were mentioning there, but now we've got the 1 in 200 year event, but you have to add climate change on top of that. When was that kind of brought in, and why, and what does it mean in practice? So just again a general explanation.
So climate change was always part of SPP. So you always had to take account of climate change in the design and how you developed a site, but it wasn't part of the delineation of the floodplain or the delineation of the area in which development or no development might be allowed. To be honest, it was a weakness of SPP because it did seem a bit daft that you knew there was going to be climate change, but you were still avoiding just the present day floodplain. You weren't looking at climate change. So I think that is a benefit or something that has come in with NPF4, which on the face of it is a good thing. We're actually trying to avoid or develop outside of the areas that will be at risk or we think will be at risk in the future. The issue is, and I think we'll come to it as we go through this discussion, is there are issues to do with perhaps the choice. That then what's important is the choice of the climate uplift and which one and the effect that has. And then I guess it's the inclusion of other precautionary components of it, which actually is meaning it does get NPF4 creates difficulties, particularly for brownfield sites. But in principle, the application of climate change in what we do is obviously, important. Is an important and is a step forward with NPF4.
But if we look at, because I think when we chatted previously and you explained and you talked a little bit there, about the percentage, what the 1 in 200 means, and then if you're adding on climate change, what percentage is that? And then we talked about a culvert blockage and how remote the flooding can potentially actually be. Can you just give us some kind of figures around that?
Yeah, and I think there's two sides. There's one. I think with climate change, the nature of brownfield sites in Scotland themselves. Mm-hmm. And then there's an argument around when we're trying to define the floodplain, what it is that we're trying to do. Obviously, NPF4 says it's a 1 in 200-year event, so a 0.5% chance.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously are adding a climate uplift to that. Often with the modelling, we're being asked to look at issues such as blockage of culvert and whether you've got embankments that might prevent flooding. Now, all of these things themselves are real and should be considered. But one of the steps would be is, are we getting to a point if we take, say, a climate uplift, which may not be the best guess or the most likely, or we take a culvert blockage that is not likely, and you're adding precautionary approaches on top of each other, are we moving away from getting a 1 in 200-year event? So we're starting with a 200, and if we're adding, scenarios that themselves have got 1%, 5% chance of occurrence, if you add the probabilities together, you rapidly get to a point that, are we actually looking at, 10,000 to 5,000, what is the probability of this event when you add the probabilities together? And I think as we talk through some of the issues that people are having with NPF4, I think that's partly maybe where it comes from, is that some of the approaches are compounding a precautionary nature, which independently is very, sensible, but you may be ending up with a flood event well in excess of what the planning policy wants. And to add it for brownfield, one of the issues I guess we'll come to is NPF4 in many ways works probably very well for greenfield sites. You may as well be precautionary. You don't want to develop on natural floodplains. But if you get into towns, one of the issues with towns is, I guess, a lot of brownfield sites in Scotland are next to rivers. They can be next to coasts, just because of the nature of the industry or whatever was there. A lot of the rivers through our towns have also been altered because over time they've probably been over deepened. They've got sides to them. So what you find is the present day 200-year often can pass through these watercourses with limited flooding. So when people have looked at maps for the 200-year, there's not a great deal. But if you add a lot of the climate change, etc., what we're seeing is suddenly you get a huge difference in the flood extents in urban areas. And it results in a lot of flooding adjacent to the watercourses. And that leads to the question, well, how do you want to address that? Do we just avoid these areas or do we want to develop them? And I think reading Policy 22, it by itself, it's kind of a managed retreat type. It's kind of a back away from the watercourses policy. But if you look at the rest of NPF4, it's obviously promoting brownfield land. So a lot of the issues we're seeing is that sort of battle between the different parts of the policy.
It's interesting because obviously when you're talking about you adding on, the precaution on top of the precautionary, you go from what you described at the beginning of the 1 in 100 potentially being in a lifetime.
Yes.
To if it's now so remote, it's however many generations away. It's not just my lifetime, it's my boys' lifetime and potentially their kids' lifetime if we're getting more and more remote.
Yeah, or what it means is that the chance of it occurring in your lifetime is less. In any 1 year, it's a lower return, lower probability. And I think in terms of the precautionary, you can have both with flood risk management. You can have perhaps a less precautionary approach for the planning to identify the flood risk area. So you could use perhaps a different climate uplift, a lower culvert blockage. You could then identify the flood risk area for development. You can then design the site to be safe or flood resilient for the precautionary scenario. So it's not like you necessarily have to get one in front of the other. You could have both of them. But at the moment, I think what you find is if we run the very high precautionary, you're seeing a lot of brownfield sites having real issues over their developability. And whether that is really what the wider NPF4 and people, want.
Yes, and it seems obviously that the Scottish Government are going to be, looking at you know, in the Chief Planner's letter that was issued in September, the indication was that Scottish Government has commissioned, you know, a research project on future climate in today's decisions, just as, you know, what we were describing today, which, you know, aims to support the use of future climate scenarios and hazards. And that report's expected out in November. And then I think we're going to be getting updated guidance, which we've been kind of promised. Have you been involved in any of the research? You know, what are your views on what it might be saying?
I haven't been involved in it. I think it will be useful to have it put in a context of what the current thinking, the current situation is. I think it'll depend on perhaps the remit and whether we're looking at what is the most likely scenario against a worst case scenario. I think we've seen, I think there was a poll or questions asked of climate scientists who felt about 2.3 degrees centigrade by the end of the century was the current path we were on. And it's whether that becomes a view that should be the sort of the best estimate scenario taken forward. Obviously, a more precautionary, say the 8.5 that's used can have, you know, over 4 degrees up, depends on up to 5 degrees increase, which is obviously higher than perhaps the current thinking, but it's whether people want to be precautionary and whether the actual climate science is saying that isn't the case, that actually where we're getting to is a higher increase. But I think it would be useful if it was in that context that we had the precautionary, but also we had an idea perhaps for the planning as to what the current best thinking is.
Mm-hmm. So we mentioned kind of SEPA's, you know, obviously involved in that review. So I kind of wanted to turn to their role, you know, in the planning process and how that fits with the planning authority's risk team before, say, we get in to look at Policy 22 itself in terms of the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, so SEPA's role is they're a statutory consultee, so they can be asked by the local authorities to comment on flood risk assessments and flood risk. It's generally to do with river and coastal flooding, with SEPA, with the local authority having a remit on surface water flooding. At the end of the day, the local authority has the final say, so SEPA can object, but it is the local authority that has to make the final decision. Mm-hmm. What I think has happened in the last year or two, what's come out is I think one of the issues, certainly for looking at development and also for local authorities, is that there can be an imbalance at the moment of where the expertise lies. Mm-hmm. So you end up, SEPA have a lot of qualified and experienced hydrologists, but the way the process is set up is if they view a site as, say, an objection, especially an objection in principle, they tend to step back then from the process, and it's passed to the local authority to make these decisions. But local authorities often don't have the suitably qualified or enough suitably qualified staff. So we end up in an awkward position whereby just when the process gets difficult and it becomes a difficult site, the people with the knowledge don't get involved, and it's now left to the local authority who then can struggle if they feel they have the expertise there. So I think there's somewhere there maybe is a better use of resources to try and help local authorities with some of these complex sites, because there are sites where, by the wording, and we'll go on to the wording of NPF4, it could be an objection, but actually there are probably ways to develop the site in a sustainable way that does manage the flood risks, but technically it may not comply with NPF4. And it's those sort of sites where you have an issue with local authority. You have consultants on the developer side saying, oh, look, you know, you could do this, but then the local authorities are sometimes have problems assessing, you know, what the consultant or the developer is saying. And if SEPA are then not involved in that process, you're losing out and using all these qualified people.
And obviously you said that, the local authority doesn't need to follow SEPA's recommendation a bit, like other statutory consultees, but they do, if they want to approve it contrary to SEPA's recommendation, have to refer it, to the minute, and
Yes.
the ministers can call it in,
Yeah.
or they can leave it. They can decide that's fine. They still want, the planning authority, or they can call it in for their own kind of determination. So there
Yes.
is that, I suppose, other part for the local authority officers to kind of deal with. So we've talked around policy 22, but the main event obviously is to kind of dig into it a little bit more detail. And you mentioned, that you have concerns that it's making brownfield development in particular difficult. And of course, at the thrust of NPF4 is to be developing brownfield sites. It's part of the sustainable kind of development. So let's have a kind of look at policy 22 and where you see, as I say, that the issues that are arising.
So I think the overall aims are good, but I think it's some of the areas of the wording. Part of it, I think, is the exceptions. So within NPF4, the basis is avoidance of flood risk. So you define your flood risk area and you should avoid it.
Yep.
But there are exceptions where you can build in these areas. And in Paul, there's 4 different types of exception.
And just run through them.
Yeah. So the first one is essential infrastructure with a location is required for operational reasons. So that can matter for green infrastructure, power infrastructure, etc. Water compatible uses, which is generally open space and playing fields. It's the redevelopment of an existing building or site for equal or less vulnerable use. So if it used to be a house, you could develop a house. If it used to be commercial, you could develop a commercial. The problem with that is that when it comes to brownfield, they're often industrial or commercial, and people want to build houses.
Yep.
So if you are looking at a brownfield commercial or industrial site, then the first 3 of these exceptions won't work. So you're really down to exception 4. And it is redevelopment of previously used sites in built-up areas where the LDP has identified a need to bring these into positive use, and where proposals demonstrate the long-term safety and resilience according to SEPA advice. It sounds quite useful, but I think it can be quite a mouthful because it's a previously used site, it's in a built-up area, and it's where the LDP has identified a need to bring it into positive use. It does work. Sometimes is the definition of whether it's a built-up area. And I think the LDP is also, I think in a perfect world, that's what you would want. You would want it to be plan-led through the LDP, but often the LDPs are not quite in sync.
That's right.
So you can bring through sites which may not be in the LDP, but they're brownfield and would be desirable to develop. And then it depends on the council's view as to whether they think it's an exception or not. So perhaps there needs to be some more flexibility or within what could be considered an exception. Even if a site is an exception, it then has to satisfy a number of bullet points. Most of those bullet points are fairly reasonable, can be achieved, but one of the issues is there should be no reduction in floodplain capacity or increased risk for others. Increased risk for others, I think, is obviously very important and is right. The no reduction in floodplain capacity is an idealized way of looking at it. If you have a brownfield site and half of the site is at flood risk and half isn't, then it allows you to maybe move the floodplain or provide the storage. But what we're seeing is if you have a brownfield site next to a river and it completely floods, then you can't really redevelop it and maintain the floodplain storage. And that becomes a big problem. Does that mean that site's impossible to achieve that? So perhaps that should have read no effective reduction in floodplain capacity. We've done a site in Glasgow where you could provide this floodplain capacity, but in the end, they provided 4 meters cubed of compensatory storage for the River Clyde. Now that technically had to be done. Technically, that was the loss, but in reality, that would have no impact. And I know there's an issue of cumulative impact, and that is an issue. But I think what we're finding along rivers, say the Water of Leith, if you run the plus climate change, you end up with a big swathe of land. So what can you do, if unless you cannot maintain that floodplain capacity? That's an issue because then things can just founder on that. It's whether that needs a change of wording or whether you're allowed to do off-site works. There's ways around it, but that is an issue. And I guess the other two aspects, and I suppose they both go together, the safe and operational and flood-free access. I think there's been a bit of a mistake in the wording in that what has come out is the wording is flood sites, certain sites must have flood-free access. And if you look at the definition of a flood in NPF4, it's the temporary covering of any surface with water. So effective, and also you have to consider every flood risk. So if it rains, look out your window, there is a temporary covering of water across much of what you can, much has got rain everywhere.
Yes.
And if you have to have flood-free access, you're basically saying that during this extreme flood event, you must have access with dry access. And often SEPA are interpreting that as dry access. Sympathize with them because that is the wording, but that has no real meaning in reality during an event of that scale. So I think a lot of NPF4 some of the flexibility is not there. It does constrain you for difficult sites. It also, I think in the writing of it, people perhaps haven't taken into account how big a 200-year plus climate change event is. There's a misscale. I mean, we looked at the flood records that the Environment Agency, SEPA, hold. And if you look back in the UK, there's probably only one event that's occurred that's greater than a 1 in 1,000-year event, which was the Cumbria flood, 2009. And there's maybe 5 or 6 floods that have had a 200-year probability. Now, if you add the highest climate change that we're looking at to a 200-year event, the 200 plus climate change, this will probably be the largest flood event ever to have happened in the UK. So it'll be a sort of event that is historic. You'll remember it. You'll tell your grandchildren that you were in the Edinburgh flood of 2028 or whatever.
Yep.
It was a huge natural disaster. But at the same time, our policy has been written as if you need to have flood-free act. You need to be able to walk out of your house and you can't get your feet wet. And the local shops have to be safe and operational during that event. So there is a bit of a mismatch between the severity of what we're looking at and some of the requirements.
Yeah, usually I think when we talked about it, so they're wanting normal life to be maintained in the most catastrophic event. We talked about that we could still go out for coffee.
Yeah, being facetious about it, it's like it's the biggest historic rainstorm in the UK history, but the planning requires us to be able to put on our normal smart shoes. Walk out to Starbucks, get a coffee, and then walk back home again. And It's just, there's a bit of I know that's probably over egging it to some degree, but the wording in there does tend to lead to that. And I think there's a bit of a miss. And the same as with the brownfield, there's a bit of a mismatch of just how big this flood is and what does it mean. And if it does mean that we shouldn't be developing anywhere near rivers in our cities, then that has to be full in front of the whole policy, and not just something that's looked at site by site.
Yeah. So you've talked about obviously the difficulties with climate uplift and the bullets under the exceptions to kind of the policy and dry access. Are there other issues which you're seeing are causing kind of concern for developments or developers in terms of meeting Policy 22?
those are the main things. I think some of the rest of it comes from, like we said, the blockages, the
Okay.
various, it comes perhaps from the SEPA guidance,
Hmm.
which again, I think all of these things are real issues.
Hmm.
There are man-made embankments which
Thanks.
you don't want to be building houses. You don't want to be relying on them for flooding,
Hmm.
and culverts and bridges will get blocked
Hmm.
during events. But I think what we're seeing coming through is often we're getting, again, it's the combination of it's a plus climate change using the highest climate scenario, and then you've got a bridge blockage at 75+%, and then you've got something else, and then you end up with a flood event that you can't, that's unmanageable at a lot of these sites. And then the question is this really the event we should be designing for, or not? Or are we moving away from a 200-year event and we're looking at something with a likelihood, well in excess of that? So
Hmm.
we've been trying through our work, trying to look at, the probable different climate uplifts and how likely they'd be. We've also looked at trying to find methods of trying to estimate sensible or reasonable culvert blockages, the sort of blockage that you would expect would be likely to occur, so that when you combine them together, you're retaining yourself within that 1 in 200 year boundary,
Hmm.
rather than expanding up to some event that's 5,000 year plus, and much more. It's not to say that you shouldn't design the site to take an account of the precautionary, but it's that combination of different things on top of each other, which just makes things very, very difficult, and perhaps overly, unnecessarily difficult.
So at the Homes for Scotland conference, the planning minister, indicated that, of course, he could still grant, planning permission contrary to SEPA's recommendations. I suppose, you've obviously outlined there what you've been trying to do in discussions with applications. Have you seen many applications being approved, post Policy 22, and I suppose as exceptions to it, or are we able to fit within Policy 22?
Yes and no. Yes, we've seen some. So, like I said, even the Clyde one with the storage, that's one that was considered an exception. And then you looked at the flood storage. So there have been a number of sites where they are exceptions and you can comply with the requirements. So that we've got a number of sites like that. We've had some sites where I think councils have shown flexibility in terms of whether a site's an exception.
Hmm.
Maybe you're looking at, the wording. A lot of LDPs, I think, have some standard wording about looking at brownfield development in urban areas. So people have been flexible in allowing things to be exceptions.
Hmm.
I think there's one that went to a reporter where for surface water, they did accept the argument that dry access in such an event was not reasonable
Hmm.
given the wider issues, the fact that the sewer system will be overwhelmed, etc. So yeah, there are a number of sites that we've seen that go through, but we also have a number of examples which seem to just get stuck because they can't comply for
With the
one way
policy.
or another. Some of which are probably just poor sites that is right. But there's other sites where they would comply under certain combinations of blockages in climate, etc., and then they don't comply if you take some of the precautionary ones. Now it's whether we just want to be precautionary and that's okay, or whether there is like a almost like an opportunity cost. If we're not right, if we're overly conservative, are we losing out on a brownfield? We've got an urban area that's not being regenerated.
Mhm.
I've got less problems, I think, in greenfielding. Like I said before, we can be precautionary. We shouldn't be building on natural floodplains, but it's when the urban area comes in, and then you've got other social concerns and desires to develop sites.
Yeah, and to be fair, I think Scottish Government, have recognised that Policy 22 is causing problems. There's been, a kind of lot of debate, and obviously that again, the Chief Planner a number of times, not just obviously about flooding, but housing, everything is reminding, decision makers that you have to look at NPF4 as a whole. And you talked about the fact that Policy 22 is causing problems for Policy 9, brownfield kind of development, and so we're awaiting that, more up-to-date guidance, I suppose, in terms of the application. From your point of view, put you on the spot here, and you have mentioned some things as you go along in terms of some wording. Are you saying that we need a new Policy 22, or is it a tweaked Policy 22, or do you think guidance will be enough? So Policy 22 remains, unchanged, but there's better guidance on how you apply it.
I think there's a mix. I think there is a guidance side of it, and it's maybe looking at this level of combination of climate blockage, etc., and whether that is the most appropriate to define a flood risk area, just to define whether you can develop a site or not. I think there's a lot that could be done there. You can maintain, like I said, the precautionary approach, maybe looking at the floor levels and the development, but would that help in allowing a way through for some sites and local authorities? Another one could be, I think, with some responses, local authorities, SEPA is perhaps more nuanced in terms of whether an objection is, this site is a stinker. You shouldn't be developing here.
And no go, yeah.
Or, you know what? It almost complied with NPF4, but it failed on a couple on these technicalities, which would maybe give local authorities a chance to look at that in more detail. The other area as well, I think, that will come in, but it's stuck, is maybe off-site mitigations. I've always thought it was you may be losing a small amount of flood storage at a site. Can a developer contribute to catchment-wide improvements that would reduce flood waters? Whether it's natural flood management, tree planting, river restoration, things further up in the catchment, a bit like what people do with funds for schools or other parts of the development. So you'd say, okay, you're losing an amount of storage, as long as it was manageable and wasn't causing a significant increase to others. You might say, we'll say our 4, 8, 10, 20 meters for the Clyde. It'd be like, well, you need to pay for that, and that money is going to be used for works in the headwaters. It will have a less quantifiable, but it will have a clear benefit in terms of the environment or flood storage. That sort of thing could greatly help, and that you could breach certain things in NPF4, but actually provide a wider benefit to the catchment, rather than always having to try and manage stuff on the site basis.
Yes.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, some of these things you don't have control over, and 10 years down the line, somebody goes, why is these flower beds set below for flood storage? I'm filling them in, so at least you would get something long term for that.
Yes.
And finally, I think in terms of there are bits of the wording though in NP4 that I think the flood-free access is problematic, because that is literally what it says.
Yep.
And that isn't, I don't think, is realistic. And I think that would ideally it would need guidance, but whether it's possible, whether that needs rewording. And then perhaps some more, like I said, more flexibility in the exceptions and the floodplain capacity reduction, either something that said effective reduction or allowed some offsite, might be things they could, that might need rewording rather than just changing guidance.
Yeah, that's helpful. You and I could speak about flooding. There's been a flood of questions, has there, George?
Yeah, there's been some. I think one that sort of keeps coming up about this 1 in 200-year event, and kind of, I suppose, the choice of that. And I think we perhaps scooted over it a little bit quickly at the beginning in terms of, do you have any insight as to why the 1 in 200-year event has been chosen and, I suppose, retained in NPF4? And also, are you aware of anyone trying to challenging it, anything specifically other than I suppose just raising it with councils and SEPA in various consultation forums.
I think that whether it's 100 or a 200-year event is probably not the main issue. I think if you look at the statistics, it's kind of a flattening curve. So the difference between a 100 and a 200 is maybe not as much as people think in terms of the size of the flood. If you look at the difference between a 5 and a 25, there's probably proportionately a bigger difference. Just the way the statistics occur, it tends to flatten out. So I think whether you're looking at a 100 or 200, it probably makes a few percent difference. The biggest difference, I think, is to do with, again, so the climate uplift. If you look at different climate uplifts, you will see quite significant differences between, 53, it could be in the fourth for the higher ones, or you could look, you could be looking at, mid 20s, 30%. So I think the bigger difference comes when you're looking at the climate change than really the difference between the 100 and the 200. And I think that's so embedded now in Scotland's way of thinking. I think that would be a tough one to say, well, we're going to drop to 100-year.
My recollection was that at a time, certainly up here, schools had to be in the 1 in 1,000. They were extra protected.
Yes, but I think with NPF4 going to the 200 plus climate change, I think they've all been put together into the one category. So it used to be, it's schools, hospitals, the like used to be a 1 in 1,000 year.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think one thing that I think strikes lots of people who aren't involved in it is, the climate change scenario that's chosen is the 8.5-degree rise rather than, let's say, the 2 to 3, which is what the best.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I think perhaps shocked people who aren't involved in it regularly, that's the scenario being applied when it's plus climate change.
8.5 isn't it isn't the temperature. The 8.5 refers to it's the energy increase. It's watts per meter, I think, squared. So it doesn't refer, but it probably equates to about a 4.4 to 5 degree centigrade increase, whereas other ones 4 and 6.5 refer more towards a 2 to 3 degrees uplift. Now, it's a difficult one. I think if you ask people, if you ask someone which one you should take, there's a lot of uncertainty with the climate change and with a lot of promises in place like the Paris Accord that should help. But in the last few years, the climate uplift it's still following a significant upward trend. So I think if you ask someone in isolation, then that's why people would be precautionary. But I think you need to ask, maybe it needs to be done within the context of planning. Is it a reasonable amount? Is it the amount that you want should be considered for planning? And that probably has to come maybe as well from planning lawyers like yourselves. Like what is expected under planning for other, not just flooding, but for transport, other aspects? Are we looking at being precautionary, or is it based on what a reasonable number? In terms of flood management, we'd obviously always, if you're designing the floor levels or a flood defense, you'd want to be precautionary. But I think it's this situation at the moment where we're getting the precautionary side of flood risk management meeting planning. And then you're like, well, we're looking at something which is, when you're deciding whether a piece of land is developable or not, is that the appropriate place to use this level of that precautionary model and the precautionary blockage? Are we looking at something that is, we're talking about different things almost?
Excellent. I mean, there were plenty of other questions. Another theme was pontificating of how councils can be resourced, how the process could be adapted. But obviously we're now at 1:45, so I will wrap up there. But just want to say thank you very much, Michael and Elaine, for taking us through that and your thoughts on Policy 22. As today's Halloween, I've been asked to say that I hope the session hasn't given you nightmares, especially if you're a developer. And in terms of our next Planning Live session, the details will come out in due course, but it will be at the end of November. Otherwise, thank you and have a good rest of your afternoon. Happy Halloween.
Thank you.